This week is International Men's Health Week, and it's time for us to focus on ways that we can keep the men and boys in our lives a bit healthier. Today I'm joined by Simon Rinne, the founder of Mindful Men, a community promoting men's mental health, well-being through counselling, therapy and their podcast. The conversation around men's mental health has definitely been growing, which is fantastic to see, but there's still a long way to go to break down the barriers and stigma and support men in their vulnerability. I hope this conversation provides an insight into men's mental health from a man's perspective. Let's get into it. I'd love to start just by welcoming you to the podcast and asking if you can tell our listeners just a little bit about you and why you are where you are today.
Yeah, so big question. So my name's Simon Rinne. I'm a social worker based here in Queensland, Australia, and I have a dedicated men's therapy business called Mindful Men, and I dedicate myself to men's mental health and disability because I have over 30 years lived experience with mental health conditions. And so I live with obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, anxiety. I've experienced burnout. I used alcohol for 25 years to kind of cope and feel normal, if that makes sense. And yeah, I wanted to use that to inspire other guys to open up as well. And so it took me 20 years, for example, to first say that I've got a mental health condition and ask for help. And so kind of want to use my story to inspire other guys to do the same.
Amazing. And what kind of reception have you received?
It's an interesting one because I reached out for help in 2012 after 20 years struggling in silence. I still kept it very hidden. My therapist knew, my doctors knew, my wife knew, but it wasn't until after I burned out in 2020 that I really started to share the story. And since then, it's been quite well received. A lot of people have come up to me and say, Simon, didn't know this about you. You wore that mask very well. And other people have come back and said, thanks so much for sharing because it's inspired me to go and seek help for myself or just recognize that I'm not alone in the world.
Yeah, amazing. And I want to ask you, if you don't mind, what do you think burnout is? There seems to be lots of sort of theories around what burnout is. What did it mean for you?
Yeah, when I experienced it, I had heard of it in the workplace. But I thought it was actually a cop-out that you didn't want to rock up to work. You didn't want to do your work. You didn't want to, you're just being lazy, for example. And I think when we think about mental health, that's probably very similar to what a lot of people say when, someone calls in sick, for example, and says, I need a mental health day. They're like, oh, what's wrong? Come on, harden up, toughen up. This is our culture. This is what we say. But it wasn't until I experienced it that I really knew what it was. And so for anyone who hasn't experienced burnout, it is prolonged chronic stress that isn't alleviated in a healthy way. And for me, that meant my world came crumbling down. So basically, I hit a brick wall that I was emotionally spent, mentally spent, physically spent. I had a mysterious back injury that we couldn't quite work out what that was. And after I got better, we identified that it was a symptom of my mental health. And so it all disappeared once I got better from the burnout. But essentially, I needed 4 to 5 months off of work. And it's lucky I had a job where I had lots of sick leave to be able to do that. And this is where I guess discovered mindfulness and the real true power of taking off your mask and sharing your story. But it wasn't until I experienced it that I knew what it felt like. And I was lucky because my GP and then my mental health social worker that I was seeing through my recovery had both experienced burnout. And so we could share the stories, those shared lived experiences, and really understand each other. And since then, I've probably burnt out another time, a bit down the track, but it wasn't as bad. It still required me to take time off of work and to recover, but I knew the warning signs a lot quicker. And for anyone who's not sure what the warning signs are, there's quite a few, and they all vary between everybody. But it's like things like you can't think properly, you've got brain fog. I was very cynical at work. I'd become very pessimistic and like nothing I was doing was right or good enough. With my obsessive compulsive disorder, I have a lot of perfectionist traits. And so I can no longer be that perfect employee for the business. And that really got me down as well. And I remember being in meetings where I'd be 10 to 15 minutes into the meeting that I was chairing, and then have this realization that I'd been talking to people for 10 to 15 minutes, but have no idea what the conversation was about. I was completely checked out. I was there doing all the things, having, conversation with people, but mentally I wasn't there. And so that scared me as well. And then to manage, a lot of people, look to substances, and alcohol was mine, and I was drinking a lot and trying to slow my brain, to numb it after work and on weekends. But that was just putting band-aids on, and this cycle would continue week after week after week. In fact, this had been coming for months, if not years. So it's not something you just wake up and you're burnt out. It's actually something that happens again and again and again over time, to the point where you simply can't function.
Simon, you've made so many amazing points that I want to go back to. One of the ones that you did highlight was that you were lucky enough to have paid leave when you were sick. And I think that's definitely a real issue for a lot of people who are self-employed or maybe have their own little business, and they're just feeling like they just can't, that they just have to keep pushing through. So I think that's definitely can be a real cultural, maybe particularly for men who feel like they can't let the side down by coming off work, particularly if it's going to really financially impact their family. Is that something that you see men struggle with a lot?
Yeah, absolutely. And me running my own small business now. So when that happened, I was in the public service. And so I could take time off, but it did impact the team. And one of the things that I had seen when I came out with my story about burnout, and I shared that in the workplace actually to try and inspire other people to get help as well, was so many people were taking time off because of burnout, but they only had 1 or 2 weeks leave. And so I just had been lucky that I had not really been that sick in my career. And I didn't just take a day off just for the sake of taking a day off. I actually banked my leave, and I could take that much time off as well. But me now, my small business, like when I'm struggling, it's really hard because I can't take a day off. Because if I do, well, I can take a day off. I'm coming around to this. But in my mind, I can't take a day off because that could be anywhere between $2,000 to $1,000 worth of income that I don't receive. And it's really hard in the mental health space to move an appointment. It's really tricky to do that because my clients have their own lives as well, and they're making time for me. And so I feel a bit of letdown and shame when I have to do that. We're actually seeing this in my family at the moment. So my wife is struggling with burnout herself. And so she's exhausted all her leave from her job. And so whenever she needs to take a day off, she doesn't get paid. And so we're balancing this. And then with kids and all that type of stuff, we're trying to find the right balance. So it is a tricky one, particularly with young families, people that are really financially stressed, and particularly in an environment and an age where cost of living pressure is huge and it's impacting our mental health. And so when we take a day off, it really does impact the finances and how the household runs and create stress as well. And so it's a tricky one, but I think a lot of people, they push through and they rock up to work and they're burnt out, and this impacts their performance. It impacts their relationships with their co-workers, or if they're working by themselves, maybe their relationships with their clients. They might be a bit snappy with their clients or something like that, or maybe a contract falls through and then the whole world comes down and they get really super stressed and anxious and angry because that's future income that's impacted. So there's a whole lot of contributing factors. But I think if we can get onto it earlier, and this is a good time that we're having this discussion because it's Men's Health Month and Men's Health Week next week, we can actually prevent things like burnout a long way before it actually occurs.
And one of the other things I thought was interesting that you pointed out, and as a GP, I see this quite a lot, is people presenting with a physical symptom. It's nearly like, in very simple terms, that your body goes, oh, well, you're not listening to me from the mental health perspective, so I'm just going to give you a physical symptom because you might stop and pay attention. And you develop back pain. I actually see that, not infrequently as well. And we often exhaust lots of investigations in physio and all sorts of things, and we just can't find something wrong with the person's back. But actually, when we start to dig deeper, it's actually, all related to their mental health. Do you have other stories of people with similar?
No, it's the first time I've ever experienced it. And I remember it coincided around COVID time, and I had been at the gym, and I actually thought I did a gym injury with my back, but then COVID happened and lockdowns happened, and I couldn't go to the gym. The back pain was still there, but I wasn't doing basically anything. And so I managed to get into my doctor and then a specialist, and we did all the scans and all the things. And the specialist said, Simon, I could go in and do surgery, but I don't know what I'm looking for. I know you've got the back pain, and it was excruciating. He said, we just got to either go in and risk damage, or we see what happens. And it just happened to be that I just said, okay, well, I don't want to go in and do that and risk further damage. But yeah, once I got the therapy part and that sorted, the back pain disappeared. And it's the first time I've ever experienced this. And it happens to coincide with the time my wife was listening to a podcast and heard a similar story. I'm like, I'd never even knew the physical could be impacted by the mental, and vice versa as well. But yeah, other people in my therapy, when they come into clinics, they talk about these pains, but as we progress through mental health treatment, they note that those pains can disappear, and they're feeling a little bit easier, and then that's heartening to hear that. But it's not just about the mental. We got to think about our health in a holistic way, and it's about what can we do holistically for mind and body so that we can, I guess, be well across the board.
So, Simon, what can we do to prevent burnout?
To prevent burnout, I think for guys, we need to start talking. It's basically as it is. We need to recognize maybe that we're stressed, and burnout is prolonged chronic stress. So if we can recognize that we're stressed or anxious or feeling depressed or just feeling off our usual game, and maybe tuning into how we're showing up. So are we drinking too much? Are we taking drugs? Are we doing all those types of things? Are we not sleeping right? Are we not exercising? Are we eating bad food? What are we doing in our lives that is making us feel terrible? And so if we can tune into that stuff and recognize that, oh yeah, maybe I am struggling, and I've been maybe getting snappy, maybe getting angry, maybe frustrated, maybe cynical. Just recognizing that in itself is the first part, and then recognizing that it's okay to talk about it, whether it's with your GP or a friend or a family member, or booking yourself into therapy. I think the more we can help guys and inspire guys to do that, the more we normalize these discussions, and they recognize, oh, it's not weak for me to go and see Simon at Mindful Men about what's going on. Because once you start opening up about it, then we can find ways to deal with it before it becomes like that volcano moment where everything goes kaput because we've just lost our marbles, in a moment of anger. So it's all about recognizing, talking about it, but also, tuning into that self-care component as well is very critical.
There's definitely been a lot more publicity and campaigns around men's mental health. Do you think we're making any inroads? Are you thinking things are improving or changing?
I think certainly the suicide data on men's mental health is pretty evident that we've got a long way to go. But one of the more positive things, I guess, out of the last couple of years, and particularly post-COVID, was it enabled us to talk about men's mental health. And we're starting to see a lot more people talking about men's mental health, which is really encouraging, seeing a lot more on the social media around this space. Social media is interesting in itself because, as someone myself who likes to put out content around men's mental health, it can be blocked by the social media platforms because you're talking about mental health, yet you can see gambling, you can see drug use, you can see violent crime on these platforms, which is discouraging because there's a lot of people out there trying to fly the flag for mental health. But there are people doing it, and it is happening, and these conversations are happening more and more. And we're seeing it also in workplaces and in sports, clubs and organizations as well, starting to normalize these discussions, which is quite encouraging.
My audience is definitely very heavily female. I'm obviously hoping they're going to share this with their partners, sons, brothers. But what tips would you have for a partner or a mother who's really concerned about their male family member? What do we not do so well when we're trying to talk to our loved ones, and what tips would you love to give us women so that we can maybe do our bit of it a little bit better?
I think it starts with us, actually. I don't think it's anything you're doing wrong. Like it's not a partner's issue or a child's issue. In fact, this is the most common question I get. I get phone calls from a loved one, family member, or even a service provider on the weekly about saying, Simon, I know a bloke in my life that needs help. How can I get them to come and see you? And so my response, unfortunately, and this is going to be the next episode that I do on the Mindful Men podcast, is you can't do anything. In fact, yesterday I said goodbye to a client because they just weren't interested in therapy. That I'd got the referral, I started the work, and it just was very obvious that they had been dragged there by their service providers, by their families, and so forth. And so it's not so much about what you're doing in the household, unless unless I'm going to put a caveat, unless you're telling the man in the household or that that he needs to suck it up, be a man to carry on, stop being such a girl or whatever. That's a bit toxic in itself. But if you're just being the loving you, then you're doing what you can do. This issue actually stems from society, community, and how we're socially constructed. So, you think about when you have a baby, and one of the first questions you might have after you figure out if it's a boy or a girl is what color clothing are you going to put on? So it starts from day one. Boy, generally blue, girl, pink. Right. And if we put a blue t-shirt on a girl, no questions are really asked. You might be like, oh, that's an interesting color for a girl, but whatever. You put a pink t-shirt on a boy, questions get asked. And this is a society issue. This is a construct that society has created that boys need to be a certain way. And so it actually starts from looking at it from that perspective. Like, how does society tell boys and men that they need to act? In our media, it's about being tough, being hard. In the schoolyard, it's about, being strong and having muscles and all this type of stuff. In the workplace, it's about being, leaders, for men. Not all men want to be leaders. Some want to be followers and so forth. And so it's about exploring all those concepts, but more on the micro level, and that's the macro level, but more at the micro level, it's just about planting seeds. And this is what I always say is plant seeds, and it might take you several years. So it took my wife 2 years, right? It took me 20 years to come to the realization that I needed to start to talk about what was going on for me. And so plant seeds, share this podcast episode. We've had some technical issues. Hopefully we got all the information from the 2 recordings that we've done. But share this episode, share the Mindful Men podcast, share something that you saw on social media that showed healthy masculinity, talk to your kids about it as well. Like, demonstrate to your children what it's like to be a healthy parent and someone who talks about their emotions. Don't shy away from those types of conversations. And then over time, hopefully enough seeds are planted so that one blossoms. And internally for the guy, he might go, okay, yep, whatever you've been saying for however long, I think I'm starting to tune into that. And so it's just about planting seeds, being patient with it. Obviously, if you're in a situation where the male's mental health is causing things like family domestic violence, you've got to protect yourself. You've got to protect your children as well. There's no qualms about that. But if it's not like that and it's just something that you need to plug away with it. Also get support for you. There's a lot of services out there that provide support for carers or support people as well. So tune into your own mental health. If you need to check into a therapist or a GP and explore what's going on, that can be helpful, because that could open up the door to a support person in your local area, for example, who's dealing with this type of stuff. But yeah, start conversations, continue those conversations, nurture those conversations, and hopefully, and I say hopefully because we can't force someone into therapy, hopefully that sparks something inside the male in your life where they go, you know what they're saying is true, and I need to go and get help. And once that happens, that's when gold happens. You can actually start to get the recovery and the growth that we're looking for. But it can be a challenge. Men are very stubborn. I was very stubborn, but it's something you can push through.
Simon, I know that lots of patients have this vision in their mind of going to see a therapist. I think they default to thinking of Fraser Crane and that they're going to lie on a black leather couch and, be psychoanalyzed. Tell us a little bit about what might happen at an appointment with you. If someone's listening and they're a little bit hesitant about what's going to happen, what kind of ways do the appointments go?
Absolutely, and I've been there on that couch. And it's about finding the right fit first. And I say this for a GP and for a therapist. So I've got two GPs, for example. I've got a family GP who we talk about mental health stuff, but he's not great at it. Like, yeah, I'm going to be honest, he's not great at it. I've got a men's mental health GP in the same clinic. And I know this because I checked the website and their bios for all the different doctors. And it says in this guy's bio, men's mental health. So I'm like, perfect. Once you do that, you're starting on the same page at least. You know, if you're going into a men's mental health discussion, find someone who likes to talk about that type of stuff. Then do the same for a therapist, right? So I never did this. I just thought, okay, I'm just going to go see my normal GP and I'm going to see the first therapist that I get a referral to. And I did that. The first 5 or 6 therapists were all just who the GP knew. And it wasn't necessarily who they knew deeply. It was just someone who they remembered from the last email that came in that said, hey, I've got a clinic, I've got space. You know, and so when I went into those therapy sessions, it was sterile, it was overly feminine, it was, you know, it was safe, it was soft, it was trying to, I guess, allow vulnerability and authenticity to come through. But I didn't quite click with them. You know, I was saying these things, they were telling me to do this homework. I'm just like, you know, it's not really for me. I'm not sitting with it. But once I found that GP that does men's mental health, and once I found my therapists who specialize in men's mental health, depression, OCD, burnout, whatever it is, I really connected with them. And that's when I'm like, okay, we're talking the same language here, so that's the first step. For me, I take therapy out of a clinic. I know what it's like to sit in a clinic all day. And as a practitioner, I find it boring. As a client of the system, I also find it boring. So I actually take therapy to the beach. And I live on the Sunshine Coast. We go for a walk and talk session, or we go grab a coffee and we go for a walk to a park and we sit in a park bench and we take it out to the natural world for several reasons. One is to take away the stigma of being in a clinic, which can be very stigmatizing. Two is to allow us to be in the natural world. So we use that for grounding purposes and to overcome things like anxiety. We can use our 5 senses to really tune into how we're feeling, but also calm ourselves in the moment. A lot of guys see me for anxiety and anger issues, for example. So doing that lifts our mood and getting fresh air as well. So we're lifting our mood. And the other reason I do it is to connect with community. So men feel lonely. They often do. And particularly in the men's mental health space, loneliness is like the next epidemic or pandemic or whatever it is. We really struggle to say, hey, I'm feeling lonely. Like that's stigmatizing in itself. I've experienced loneliness for a long time and I'm only just now talking about it, for example. And so by taking it out of the clinic into community, you know, we might be going for a beach walk and we just might do that incidental hi to someone who's walking past. Or we do the smile, the awkward smile as you're walking past someone. And it just enables us to feel connected to something bigger than what we might experience if we're sitting in the clinic, 4 walls, no windows, or whatever. And so that's why I take it out. And so this helps to normalize it for men, like going out and talking about things, helps them to feel connected, helps them to feel part of nature, which is all very healing in itself. But for other guys, it's clinic based. It's sitting in the clinic and you're talking on the couch and there's tissues there and all that type of stuff. If that's what a guy needs, that's what a guy needs. Other things could be like going for a drive. So, you know, it could be getting with a guy and going for a drive because that way we're side by side as opposed to forward and back. And there's no, I'm the practitioner, you're the client. It's just like, hey, there's just two guys going for a drive and talking about stuff as well. Not every therapist does it. And in fact, very few therapists do this because it can be like, oh, I'm not allowed to. I'm meant to be sitting in a clinic. That's my role. But if we're going to start normalizing mental health and breaking down the barriers of mental health, I think we also have to break down the barriers of how mental health can be treated. It's all about connection, community, fresh air, doing things differently, and particularly for men, doing it side by side as opposed to you're on the couch, I'm on my little comfy chair, and off we go.
Why do you think men are struggling more with loneliness than women?
I think because it's really hard to talk about. And an example being like I've moved around a lot. So I grew up in Adelaide, I've lived in Canberra, I've lived in Hobart, Brisbane, and now on the sunny coast. And I know a lot of guys have done the same. They're doing fly in, fly out work. So they're spending a lot of time away from family, or they just really struggle to make friends. And this is an interesting one because I met a guy through podcasting and he's happened to be on the sunny coast. And one day we said, oh, let's catch up. And have some lunch or something like that. And we all say this, but we never do it. Like, it's just something that's nice to say. And we have this vision in our head, oh, yeah, that'd be nice to catch up with that person. But we never do it. We feel socially awkward about that. And so that sat there for about 6 months. And then eventually we touched base again and said, hey, let's go and do this coffee thing or lunch thing. And we did. We booked it in. We did it. We had a great conversation. We never met each other outside of a Zoom call. And I think we were there for about 2 hours having a cup of coffee, something to eat. At the end of it, he said, Simon, and we're 40-year-old men, right? He said, Simon, I want to be your friend. Like, this has been such a great conversation. I want to continue this. Let's do this again. And I felt really awkward and weird, but at the same time, I'm like, yes, I want the same thing. And so I said, I want to be your friend too, right? Why is this so hard for a 40-year-old to say? I've got a 7-year-old boy. He goes back to friends with someone who's just got the same colored t-shirt on. That's it. And so I think we can take a snapshot out of our kids' lives and go, you know what? If we're feeling disconnected, we're feeling lonely, when we move around a lot, it's very hard to break into new social circles, for example. And so let's take a leaf of our kids' book and just say, hey, do you want to be a mate? Let's go. Let's go grab a coffee or go for a surf or go climb a mountain or something, as opposed to what we're traditionally taught to do, which is go to the pub and beer. And that's a thing in itself, is like, we think we have to go and drink, and we do that. And then those relationships stay very superficial. And we're slapping on these band-aids thinking that we're healing mental health by going to the pub, having a few beers, getting things off our chest. But what we're doing is we're not healing anything. We're just kicking it down the path for the next time that we feel the pain. But doing something a little bit different, like a coffee date, going surfing. And now I've created this surf crew with this dude, and we go surfing every Wednesday morning, and we do it as a non-negotiable. We grab a coffee afterwards. We're doing something healthy, and we're going deeper with our conversations. And I think a lot of guys, say in that 40 and plus, age bracket, are looking for that type of stuff. They're looking for deeper connection. But often it doesn't come because they're scared of saying, I need a friend, or I need to do something. So I think, let's do it. Let's go out and meet someone and say, hey, let's be a mate, and do it in a healthy way, not just going to the pub.
Well, I know that you've mentioned vulnerability. I'm a big Brené Brown fan, and love all her work on vulnerability. I think most people probably hadn't thought about the term until she kind of made it quite popularized. But, men definitely do struggle probably a lot more with vulnerability than women. How is that something that you're approaching with your patients or clients?
Yeah, absolutely. And embracing that lived experience therapist. In through uni, was always taught you separate the professional and the private. And there's a reason for that. Therapy is not about you as a practitioner. But when you can share something from you that is helpful and is intentional, and particularly in the men's space, it really enables them to go, oh, Simon struggled with alcohol, and I struggle with alcohol. What's a tip that he used to get off the grog when he turned 40? And that's what I did. Or Simon knows what it's like to feel depressed. Or Simon knows what it's like to have suicidal ideation. How did you get through that, Simon? And we talk about it. I often say to the guys, I don't do anything in session that I haven't done with my own therapist. So I'm learning from my own therapist as well, and my supervisors and all the people around me about what they do. And I share, because sharing is caring in this space. Like, we're not meant to just, be these robotic practitioners who only look at their book smarts and not their street smarts. People want the street smarts. And I think for the first 5, 6, 7 therapists that I went to, and same with the GPs, they were all the book smarts people, but they didn't come across as having those street smarts. But when I found that lived experience social worker when I burnt out, and that lived experience GP when I burnt out, I'm like, oh, we're talking the same language. It's so much easier than you know what I'm saying when I say this. I don't have to articulate it in 3 different ways. And so for me, it's embracing that lived experience therapist and going, you know what? I'm human. I have my ups and downs. I'll say to my clients, they're like, how are you going today? I'm like, oh, I'm not doing too well today. My anxiety's up, or my OCD's up, or my depression's up. And they go, oh, thanks. That's awesome, because now I can talk about it too. And that's where I leave it there, unless they want to dive and say, okay, how do you process that? Because I'm thinking the same. Like, okay, well, let's explore that. But I always bring it back to them. It's always about them, and how can we use that lived experience for purpose? It's just not for me to debrief, because that's what I do in my own therapy sessions.
One of the other things that I think a lot of patients and practitioners worry about it, around suicide, is that if they mention it to someone, that they're going to put it into their head. And one of the things I always want to reassure someone is that if you mention suicide or self-harm to someone, you're not going to give them the idea. They've already thought about it. You're not putting it into their mind. And obviously for a lot of people, they're feeling like that's really outside their comfort zone. But I think, I would love to get it out there again. I'd love to normalize those conversations a lot more, and not to make someone feel like they have to become the therapist. Obviously, they can just be the friend or the mother or whoever. But I think, it's just to reassure people that just because you mention something, it's not putting it in their mind. They're already thinking of it anyway. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And up until a couple of years ago, when I started my private practice, I hadn't been trained in suicide. I'd had suicidal ideation growing up, and it comes and goes. But I did this great training. It's a SIST program, so it's around applied suicide intervention strategies, stuff like that. And one of the best things I took from that is that, let's just say it. Are we talking about suicide? So once we do, we know, okay, we're talking about suicide. And you don't have to be a practitioner to ask that question. You can say, are we talking about suicide? Are we clear? Are we on the same page? And if someone says, yeah, I am, and if you're a practitioner and you're trained in that space, off you go. You do your suicide safety planning and whatever else you need to do. But if you're not, it could be like, oh, do you want me to, I don't know how to talk about suicide, about Lifeline or Men's Line. Men's Line is a great alternative to Lifeline. They're specialised in men's health. Or can I take you to the hospital where you can continue this? Or can I take you to your GP? Like, there are things you can do that doesn't involve you becoming the therapist and having that difficult conversation. But you're right. Just because we say it doesn't mean it's put into their head that they're going to then go do it. It actually opens the window and say, let's explore that. And suicide is just a word. It's the same as depression, as OCD, as mental health, as physical health. It's just a word in the dictionary. So if we can look at it from that lens and go, suicide is just an experience that we have in life. Once we're talking about it's open, we're into that conversation, then we know what we're dealing with. But if we assume, then that can cause more harm than good. And so we don't want to assume, we just want to name it, because once we name it, we can tame it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Simon, what about fatherhood? Do you feel that maybe, sometimes a lot of emphasis can be on mum and bonding and postnatal depression, and rightfully so. It's obviously a very, very challenging time after having a baby and readjusting. But do you see men finding that transition to fatherhood a struggle?
Yeah, absolutely, because I feel that they'll come last. and I always say, just like you just said it as well, like, obviously we take a back seat when it comes to giving childbirth. My wife's done it twice, and it was horrific. Like I won't go into the gory details, but she had two cesareans. One was unplanned and one was planned. And I don't wish that on anybody. But now we have two beautiful children, so I do thank her immensely for going through that pain. But leading up to the childbirth and particularly afterwards, a lot of guys feel like they come last. And I read this great article when I was at university. It was around maternal gatekeeping, and it's around the notion of health providers, for example, focusing so much on bub and mum that they forget to ask the dad what's going on for them. How are you coping? What's going on for you? Do you have any questions? And I thought it was a really interesting article because I'd never come across it until I experienced it myself. And so we had, for example, our son, he struggled with sleep. He would only breastfeed to sleep. And he wouldn't come to me. I couldn't give him a bottle. I couldn't do anything. And it was all on my wife to do. And so we had to go through sleep training, sleep schools. We had a sleep consultant. And the sleep consultant, I remember I was a really involved dad, and I still am. I wasn't someone to say was, but I was really, really involved in those early years, asking a lot of questions. But every time she would respond to my wife. I'm like, hang on, I'm here. I'm the one asking these questions. And I felt this big. I felt like felt so small because she kept referring back to my wife. I'm like, I'm trying to do this as well. And so a lot of dads feel they feel like the health professionals are focusing too much on the mum and the bub. And again, rightly so, but we still just got to remember dad's still there. Dad's still struggling. He hasn't got sleep as well. He might be going to work when mum's at home, or vice versa. I remember a little period where I tried to be the stay-at-home dad, and I struggled through that. Like, it was really tough. And I said to my wife after a while, like, I can't, I can't do this. Like, you do it really well, and I do it very average. So I had to recognize that and step back and go back to work to allow my wife to take back that control. But it's just that recognition that, men are there, dads are there, they're struggling. And I think a few dads come into therapy for that type of stuff as well, or they're seeking different support through social media for that very issue. And there's, in fact, a few podcasts that have sprouted out of this very issue around dads not getting enough focus and attention in this particular space. But it is, again, like all men's mental health discussions, it's just a discussion point that we need to have and continue so that we can help normalize the fatherhood experience as well.
You mentioned that you've given up alcohol. Is that right? I have been reading and hearing a lot of growth in this space of people sort of completely removing alcohol from their life. Are you happy to share a little bit about your experience with that?
Yeah, I'm probably an oversharer, so she would have guessed by now. This is a great segue from fatherhood in terms of my fatherhood story as well. So for as long as I've known my wife, she's asked me to cut back on the beer. And like most Aussie blokes, I said, no, 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 I'm good. I've got this under control. It's part of my culture to drink a lot, get drunk, use alcohol to de-stress, etc., etc. In fact, around 28 years old, my wife was noticing this thing that I was doing. So I'd go to Friday night drinks after work. I'd get drunk. I'd be that larrikin guy in the pub, dancing or singing or carrying on, being a bit of a larrikin. And I'd have a great time. But then the next day, I would start ruminating about the night before. And I would do this for days to a point where I forget what was reality and what my brain was trying to say happened. This is a version of obsessive compulsive disorder called pure O, so pure obsessions. That's all we do is we ruminate over and over again. This is getting me quite sick. I'd start vomiting from anxiety as a result, not from hangover, but from actual anxiety. And this would last for days. And then it would eventually calm down when I went back to work, realized that I hadn't said anything to anybody or done anything that was going to get me into trouble back at work. This is one of the things that started me to go and see therapy at the start. But even though I was diagnosed 2012 with OCD, not a single practitioner wanted to treat it. They never talked about treating it. They just wanted to give me the label for it. So I still struggled with it. And alcohol really ramped it up. When I drank, it gave my brain the night off. But then the next day, my brain would switch into overdrive and say, Simon, you had the night off. Let's go. It's time to party. And so I didn't like that about myself. Becoming a dad, I was still drinking, happened to coincide with my social work studies, where I was able to start looking at the world in a different way and looking at my place in the world in a different way. And so start learning about theories and grand theories, capitalism, consumerism, feminism, all these types of isms, and start to understand that, these social constructs around masculinity. Was it mean to be a boy and a man, for example? Alcohol misuse, drug use, mental health. I start to understand these concepts at a deeper level, through reading and articles and essays and so forth. And then as time went on, so I started thinking about that. And then as time went on, my kids got a little bit older, they could start to talk. And then they might be say, Daddy, it's a weekend. Are you having a drink on the weekend? And I'm like, I am actually, but I didn't like that conversation with my 3 or 4 year old. It didn't sit well with me, but I still did it because I was trying to cope with life. I was trying to cope with my mental health. And then as the time went on again, I became a therapist and I'd be having conversations with guys about their drinking. And I would tell them, you've got to stop drinking. You've got to slow down your drinking. Drinking is a depressant. But then I'd go home, like most people, and I'm like, oh man, I've had a stressful day. I'm going to have a few drinks. And I felt like a fraud as a practitioner in that space because I was doing the opposite of what, I was telling my guys, so I call them my guys. I was telling my guys to do in therapy sessions. And the kids were getting older as well. And we'd start, we'd go to the pub and I'd designate myself as a designated drinker and my wife as a designated driver because she didn't like to drink. And so she was always driving. But then I'd be in the passenger seat and my kids would be like, Daddy, you're in the passenger seat. Why aren't you driving? This is weird because you usually drive. And so I then have to have a conversation with them about responsible drinking and driving, but also like I didn't want to have that conversation with a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old. And so over time, these little things plugged away. These were all these seeds planted within me that, got to my 40th, and I thought I'd get all these wonderful gifts for my 40th birthday last year. And all I got was beer. It was just nothing but different craft beer. And the old me would have loved that. Absolutely. We're getting plastered tonight. The 40-year-old me, the dad, the therapist, this guy in the modern world, like, this sucks. Like, I hate this. So I had a good conversation with my wife. She said, Simon, the reason this happened is because this is your identity. This is what people know you for. And I think the social worker, the dad, the modern man came out in that conversation, which was, I was heavily drunk at the time. I said, I don't want this anymore. Enough's enough. I know better. I want to change. So the next day we poured it all out, or we gave it away. There was lots of beer. There was hundreds of dollars worth of beer that we gave away. And I felt great. And all those conversations with my kids have stopped around alcohol. However, more recently, I've been having non-alcoholic beer because I've been finding, like, that it's not as bad as people make it out to be. And in fact, talking to other guys who are also sober, they're like, yeah, have a non-alcoholic beer. That's like, it's still a beer, but there's no alcohol in it. And so it took me a long time to get over that stigma and shame of having a non-alcoholic beer. But once I did, I'm like, you know what? They're right. Like, I can drink a couple of them. And before, historically, I would drink and drink and drink. I'd never stop. With a non-alcoholic beer, I could be done after one or two. Like, I'm actually done, and I put it down. I don't need another one. And then I can drive, or I can be dad and not be drunk. So it's been a good journey, but it took a long time. It took 25 years to get to that space. But I thank my kids for it. I mean, I'd like to say I thank my wife for it, but I think I let her down in that space because I never listened to my wife. I listened to my kids. I listened to that social worker and that therapist in me. But hopefully part of me thought about my wife as well. But I also thank her now that I'm sober a year almost, next month. So
amazing, amazing. So we're nearly out of time. I just wanted to ask you if you have any mindfulness hacks that you could share with the audience.
Plenty of mindfulness hacks, but I think in light of what we talked about, it's nothing changes if nothing changes. So when we're talking about mental health, we've really got to identify it from within. We've got to identify that things aren't great. And so this is a great mindfulness hack because it comes from within. It tunes into our values of how we want to live our lives and so forth. So that's the best one I can do is look at yourself in the mirror. That can sound really daunting, or have a think about how you're showing up in life. And if it's not working out, or if it's not the life you wanted to live, make changes, whether it's your drinking, whether it's what you talk about in terms of your mental health, whether it's your career, your friendship circles. Make changes, because once you make positive changes, then more positivity comes and more positivity comes, and then we can manage our health and well-being better, and we can normalize all these things. So that's start there, and then switch that own light bulb on inside, and just run with it. Once it's on, run with it.
Awesome. I ask everyone who comes on the podcast the same question: what piece of advice would you give to your 20-something self?
Well, this is a hard one. I'd go back further, my 8-year-old self, and recognize, because this is when OCD came into my life. Quick story, I like a story, is I was in a schoolyard and another student said to me, Simon, if you stop using your voice, you're going to lose your voice forever. So this created an obsessive thought, and to alleviate that, performed a compulsive behavior, which was humming, and that was my entry into OCD. I wish I would tell my 8-year-old self that you cannot talk, and that people go on these silent sabbaticals and they still have their voice. I wish I could tell myself that, because I don't know if I'd ever go down this track if I didn't believe that as an 8-year-old. So I'd go right back even further than a 20-year-old to my 8-year-old self and reassure him that's okay. You can not talk for a little while and your voice will still exist.
Awesome. Well, we're glad that you're still talking, because it's been great to chat with you today. Simon, thank you so much. And thank you for everything you're doing for men in Australia and obviously globally as well, with your podcast, etc. If anyone wants to get in touch with you or wants to follow you, tell us how they can do that.
Yeah, just go through the website. So it's mindful-men.com.au, and that links to all my socials. It links to the Mindful Men podcast. I'm all over most of the socials as well. So yeah, just shoot me a DM, or sign up to the newsletter on the website, or come listen to the podcast. I'm all over the place. So yeah, just head to the website and go from there.
I think you'll agree we've had some incredible guests on the podcast already, and today's was no exception. I think there is so many nuggets of information I'd love to get out there. So if you know someone who would benefit from the podcast, please share it. That way more people can learn all about themselves. Remember, this podcast is all about you. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it do not constitute medical, healthcare, or other professional advice. Information is provided for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you have any health concerns, always consult your doctor.